All right, thanks Hyra, and thanks all the previous speakers for introducing the survey, and now we're going to get to some of the meat of the findings. And I'm going to start off by talking about some of the national level trends, and then Dr. Zhang will move to the provincial level. So just to give you the context of when we took the survey, because this will be important for some of the findings that we're going to discuss, the survey was conducted from August to November of 2016, which means that it occurred after the National Assembly elections, and it also occurred after a major environmental issue that struck Vietnam that made national attention, and this is going to be important for the context of the findings. It also occurred after the transition to a new government. I won't go through too much of this rest of this slide because it's been discussed before, so we can get to the findings. Just to give you a sense of what we need to change this year, reflecting the fact that, as Dr. Tao mentioned, we need to make sure that the survey sort of accurately captures the unique Vietnamese experience. We do constantly update the indicators, and so we've changed some of the indicators this year. And also reflecting the fact that there are major issues that are pressing in Vietnam, we also try to ask timely questions at the national level. And so this year, we had new questions about citizens' perspectives on the environment. We had some questions about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which of course Vietnam was going to be a member of. We have new questions on citizen engagement with elected officials. We also have a battery of questions on inequality and citizen perspectives on inequality. Unfortunately, because I only have a few minutes here to talk, I can only touch on some of these important issues, but of course, if anyone's interested in some of these particular issues, I'll be happy to answer questions related to that. So each year when I do this presentation on the national level trends, this is the first question I'd like to point to, because I think it is sort of a real accurate snapshot of what citizens of Vietnam are concerned about. And this is a question that is asked in surveys across the world. Pew Research, Gallup asks this question in other countries. And so we're the only survey that asks this question in Vietnam, which is an open-ended question on what is the issue of greatest concern to you. So citizens can answer anything they want. Consistent with last year, we find that poverty and hunger, xóa đói giảm nghèo, is the most important issue for Vietnamese citizens. 24% of Vietnamese citizens said this was the #1 issue for them. Startlingly, this year, the environment surged as an important issue for Vietnamese citizens. 12% of citizens said this was the most important issue facing Vietnam this year. To give you a sense of why this is so startling, we can compare it to 2015. So if we look at the change in the importance of specific issues from 2015 to 2016, we can see that the environment surged in importance by 10%. So this means that basically only about 1% to 2% of people thought this was an important issue in 2015, and it surged up to 12%, which is an amazing increase. We should also note that poverty and hunger also did increase as an important issue by about 6%. So we get this question about poverty and hunger a lot, which is, if Vietnam has reduced poverty so much, why are so many people still concerned about it? So we tried to disaggregate who is concerned about specific issues by income level, thinking that perhaps it's the most poor individuals that are most concerned about poverty and hunger. And in fact, we do find a relationship. So at the lowest income levels, it is the case that citizens at that level are more concerned about poverty and hunger. So about 35% of people at the lowest level of income said it was the most important issue. The environment was second, but only at about 10%. Moving to the highest level of income, we can see that poverty and hunger is less important than for the poorest citizens in Vietnam. And the environment is comparatively higher. About 17% of the wealthiest citizens in Vietnam said the environment was their most important issue. So this suggests that it certainly is the case that poor individuals are more concerned about poverty and hunger. However, I think it's worthy of note that even at the highest income levels, there is still a concern about poverty and hunger. So across Vietnam, there seems to still be a consensus that this is the issue the government should concentrate on. However, the environment is increasing as something that the government should pay attention to. Now, we wanted to probe to see who is concerned about the environment. And in particular, the obvious hypothesis was that this probably has something to do with the fish disaster that occurred in central Vietnam. And so we put together a map of the country and looked to see where we saw the biggest shifts in people increasing their concern about the environment. And what it suggests is that on the left we see the 2015 map, which is that basically less than 2% of people across the country were concerned about the environment. Fast forwarding to 2016, we can see that the increases were highest in those provinces that were affected by the fish disaster. So this suggests that it certainly has something to do with it. However, what's also important to note is that the concern wasn't just concentrated in those areas. So citizens across the country were paying attention to this news, and it's reflected in the fact that, despite the fact that it's those provinces that had the biggest increase, there was a large and substantial increase in interest in the environment across the country. So the implications of this is that it certainly is the fish crisis that sparked the interest, but this interest is not just localized in those particular areas. So given the fact that from the most important issue, we can see that people are concerned about poverty and also concerned about the environment, a natural question is how citizens trade off these two policy priorities. Which priority do they value more? And so one thing that we did in the survey this year, and we were able to do this because we now do our survey on tablets, which I think is something we haven't mentioned yet, but is certainly a major advance for PAPI. We randomly created 2 hypothetical candidates for the National Assembly that varied on lots of different traits. And we randomly gave them 4 different policy priorities. So we said, candidate 1, maybe they're going to emphasize anti-poverty assistance. Candidate 2, maybe they're going to emphasize trade. Candidate 3, the environment. Candidate 4, environmental protection. And so what we can see is that the most popular hypothetical candidate was the one emphasizing poverty reduction. The environment was second, trade promotion and economic growth were third and fourth. So what this suggests is that people are more concerned about the environment, but still economic considerations predominate for citizens. So moving forward, this year we also had a lot of questions about land and land use rights, reflecting an issue that PAPI has emphasized throughout its creation. Zhang's going to talk about some of those findings a bit later. But this year we wanted to ask a particular question that hasn't been asked before, which is equal access to land use rights certificates. So one issue in Vietnam that's been raised by a lot of people in this room is concern that women are less likely to have their names on land use rights certificates. And this is important because if the husband dies, for example, this can mean the rights of the wife are not going to be secured from expropriation. And so this year we asked whether or not the respondents had their name on a land use rights certificate, and if not, why not? And so this shows you the difference between males and females in Vietnam in terms of whether or not they have their names on land use rights certificates. And what we find is that across the country, women are 13% less likely to have their names on land use rights certificates. And the difference is most pronounced in rural areas, where it increases to 18%. And so we asked the question, okay, why is this? And what's important from this particular table is this particular reason. So for men, only 9% said they didn't have their name on the land use rights certificate because their spouse did. Whereas for women, 32% said they didn't have their name on the land use rights certificate because their husband did. And so what this means is that there is still an important issue where women are less likely to have their names co-signed on land use rights certificates than men. And so this gives us a little bit of a baseline, something that we've suspected but didn't have data on. This gives us a baseline through which to measure improvement in terms of equalizing access to land use right certificates moving forward. One other area I want to focus on that was a striking national trend from this year is public service delivery. So, across the dimension, there hasn't been that much of an improvement. However, one specific subdimension of public service delivery did see, a striking improvement this year, which was public health. We can see that the index bumped up somewhat substantially this year. And so we wanted to see why this was. And what was striking from the data is that most of this increase was due to the fact that about 10% more people in Vietnam this year reported having health insurance than in the previous year. Previous years it was fairly stable at about 60%, and in 2016 there was a substantial jump in people that had access to health insurance. Now this was partially explained by the fact that the government did engage in a push last year to try to increase access to health insurance. What was nice to see is that this push actually had measurable effects that we could pick up by the fact that we do this on an annual basis. We were able to see very clearly this year that those government efforts were actually being manifested in actual action on the ground. So these are the main highlights from the national level findings. I don't have the opportunity to go through some of the other findings in great detail, but I do want to highlight three things that we've also looked at this year at the national level. So we asked, as I mentioned, some questions on inequality and citizen perspectives on inequality. And one thing that we noted this year was that Vietnamese citizens in general are not that dissatisfied with inequality. Only about 26% of people suggested that inequality is too high in Vietnam, which we thought was perhaps surprisingly low. But in general, Vietnamese citizens aren't, at least in surveys, expressing that they're concerned with inequality. But again, this is a baseline, and we can see how this evolves over time. We also, in your package, you can see some information on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We asked some questions about citizen perspectives on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And in general, it showed that Vietnamese citizens were very supportive of the partnership and most of its elements. However, there was extremely low levels of awareness of the agreement. So only about 25% of people said that they'd ever heard of the agreement. When we told them what was in the agreement, most of them liked it, but most of them were still relatively unaware that the agreement had been, what was in the agreement. And then finally, we had a lot of questions this year on the voting in elections. And I haven't been able to include those in the interest of time. We're going to have a separate workshop tomorrow that's just devoted to the elections and all the interesting findings that we found. But I think I want to highlight two things. First, we asked some questions about whether citizens participated in meetings with the candidates before the election. So as you know, in Vietnam, National Assembly delegates, candidates are not allowed to campaign through the media, but they do have meetings where citizens can come and hear them out on what issues they're concerned about. What we found is consistent with last year, is that citizens, these so-called professional voters, are by and large the ones that are invited to these meetings. So overwhelmingly, it's party members. And there's also a gender dimension where it's male party members that are most likely to be invited to these meetings. And so there is not a lot of access for most citizens in terms of meeting with their delegates. We also analyzed the impact of the gender quota for the National Assembly elections. As you might know, in 2016, there was a quota for 35% of candidates must be women. And seeing whether or not this led to an increase in women elected to the National Assembly. As also some of you might know, there are not 35% women in the National Assembly, it's about 26%. And so we asked whether or not citizens were discriminating in some sense against women, given that so many of them lost in terms of the election. And what we found is, again, citizens don't really discriminate. Citizens are happy with men or women, that's not a primary factor. The reason for the difference is primarily because the types of candidates that are nominated that are women have the characteristics that voters don't prefer. And in particular, centrally nominated party member candidates, who tend to win by a larger amount, usually are men, as opposed to women. So the types of women candidates is the reason why there aren't more women that are elected. It's not because they are women per se. And so what this means is that there needs to be an emphasis on looking at the nomination process. Why are certain candidates nominated? But again, these are some findings that the PAPI survey revealed. We're going to go into those in more detail tomorrow. But this is a snapshot of the national level trends, and we'd be happy to have some questions about some of these other findings in the Q&A. Thanks.